What happens when a group of criminals targets a black woman at a cafe, assuming she's an easy mark for robbery, only to discover, too late, that she's waiting for her Navy SEAL father? Watch as the seasoned veteran risks everything, fighting off the gang to protect his daughter. The city cafe buzzed with its typical late-afternoon energy. Angela Parker sat outside, basking in the sun's warmth as it kissed her skin. Her cappuccino, untouched, rested on the table, the foam's perfect swirl catching the golden light. With one hand scrolling through emails on her phone, she half-focused on the lively hum of the streets around her. Initially, Angela didn't notice the three men. Their laughter blended seamlessly into the city's background noise, the clatter of cups, the occasional burst of conversation. Only when their voices grew louder and footsteps closer did she look up. The trio strolled down the sidewalk with an air of ease, but their movements were calculated. Leading the pack was a tall, wiry man whose sharp smirk matched the way his eyes scanned everything. Behind him followed two others. One, a blonde with a scar etched along his jaw, and the other, a stocky man in a hoodie, chuckling at a joke only they found funny. Angela's eyes flickered back to her phone, unease barely creeping in. The cafe patio was crowded. Families, couples, groups of friends. She wasn't alone. Yet her fingers tightened around her device as tension began to build. A scraping noise jolted her, chairs shifting across the pavement. The three men had stopped, and now they stood near her table. The tall man grinned wider, his eyes darting between her and the empty chairs surrounding her. "Nice day, isn't it?" he said casually, his tone light, almost too friendly. Angela gave a faint nod, lips pressed into a polite yet tight smile. She didn't respond, hoping silence would send the message to move along. But they didn't. "Mind if we sit?" he asked, already dragging a chair out before she could refuse. The blonde chuckled. "Why ask her? She doesn't care." His words stung in a way Angela hadn't expected, and her gaze darted toward the cafe entrance, scanning for a waiter or anyone who might intervene. "Relax," the tall one said, leaning back in the seat he had claimed. "We're just being friendly, right, guys?" Forcing a smile, Angela swallowed the growing unease tightening her stomach. "We'll just hang out here for a bit," the blonde teased, his tone dripping mockery. "You don't mind, do you?" Angela didn't reply, but her pulse quickened. As the minutes passed, the leader's smirk remained steady, his gaze sweeping across Angela's belongings like a predator sizing up prey. His friends mirrored his confidence, their smugness hanging thick in the air. "You don't really seem like you belong around here," the leader sneered, his tone feigning casual curiosity. "So, what brings you to this side of town?" Angela hesitated. Her voice low and steady, she finally said, "Just grabbing coffee." The blond man leaned forward, pointing at her purse. "That's a fancy bag for just a coffee run. What's inside? Bet it's full of goodies, huh?" Angela instinctively clutched her bag, her voice clipped. "It's just a purse." "Relax," the blonde snickered. "No need to get jumpy." The third man laughed. "She acts like we're gonna rob her or something." Angela's heart sank. Her eyes darted around, searching for help, but everyone nearby was engrossed in their own conversations. The tall man leaned in closer. "You seem nervous, Angela." The sound of her name caught her off guard. She hadn't told them that. They must have overheard it earlier when she ordered her drink. "I'm not nervous," she managed, though her trembling voice betrayed her. Their laughter echoed cruelly as the blonde tapped her coffee cup. "Haven't even touched your drink yet. What's wrong?" "Not thirsty." Angela shoved the cup away, frustration rising. The tall man sat straighter, his expression darkening. "So, what's in the bag?" "Nothing important," Angela replied, holding it tighter. "Well, that's for me to decide," he said, his hand reaching out. Angela jerked the bag back. "Don't touch my stuff." Her voice was louder now, catching a few glances from other tables. The smirk faltered briefly before the leader leaned back again, mocking her. "Feisty. I like that." Paul chuckled harshly. "Maybe we should stick around. She's got some fight in her." Angela's heart thundered in her chest, but she met their stares with defiance. "Leave me alone," she demanded, her voice shaking but determined. "Leave you alone?" The leader echoed, his smirk widening. "Oh, we're just getting started." With a subtle motion, the blonde stood, blocking her path to the cafe. The third man flanked her from behind, boxing her in. Angela's breathing quickened as the leader rose slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow. With a swift motion, he snatched the purse from her lap. "Stop!" Angela cried, her hands darting to reclaim it. Greg snatched the purse away with unsettling ease. "Calm down," he said with a laugh, casually opening the bag. "We're just having a look." Angela shot up from her chair, the scraping of its legs loud against the concrete. "Give it back," she demanded. Ryan smirked, giving her shoulder a light shove that forced her to stumble back a step. "Sit down, sweetheart. You're making a scene." Angela's voice faltered, caught in her throat as her eyes darted around the cafe. Desperation filled her gaze, but the other patrons seemed frozen, unsure whether to step in or avoid involvement altogether. Greg rummaged through her purse and pulled out her wallet with a victorious grin. "Well, well, look at this," he said, tossing it casually to Ryan. Catching it with one hand, Ryan flipped it open, grinning as he examined the contents. "Looks like someone's doing pretty well for herself," he said mockingly. Angela felt her face burn with humiliation, tears stinging her eyes as anger and helplessness warred within her. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her instincts screamed that it would only make things worse. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "take the money and just leave." Greg's smirk widened as he tossed her purse to Paul, who eagerly rifled through it. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Greg said, his tone almost condescending. "We'll be on our way soon enough." Paul pulled out a satisfied grunt, eyeing the items inside. Meanwhile, Greg's gaze shifted to Angela's wrist, spotting her bracelet. He reached for it, but Angela instinctively pulled her arm back. Now," Greg said, his voice suddenly icy. "Don't make me ask twice." Angela's hands shook as she hesitated, the weight of the moment crushing her resolve. Finally, she unclasped the bracelet with trembling fingers and handed it over. "Good girl," Greg sneered, pocketing the bracelet with a smug grin. With a motion to his companions, the three men began walking away, laughing and congratulating themselves. Angela collapsed back into her chair, her entire body trembling as a cocktail of fear, anger, and shame washed over her. The cafe patio seemed to resume its usual rhythm as if nothing had happened, but for Angela, everything had changed. Her hands rested on the table, trembling as she stared blankly at the retreating figures. The laughter of the men still echoed in her ears, Greg casually tossing her bracelet into the air like a trophy. "Angela!" The sound of the familiar voice jolted her from her daze. Turning, she saw her father, James Parker, striding toward her from the cafe entrance. His presence was commanding, sharp, and filled the space with authority. A flicker of relief rose in Angela's chest, but was quickly replaced by a wave of shame. "Dad!" she whispered weakly. James's sharp eyes swept over her, his expression shifting instantly from confusion to concern as he noticed her pale complexion and shaking hands. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm yet firm. Angela lowered her gaze to the table. They took my purse. And my bracelet," she said, her voice breaking. James's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as his focus shifted to the group of men. They were already halfway down the sidewalk, their mocking laughter still audible. "Stay here," James said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Dad, don't," Angela pleaded, but he was already moving. James crossed the patio in long, purposeful strides, his presence impossible to ignore. The gang had just turned the corner when his deep, commanding voice rang out. "Hey!" The men stopped, their laughter fading as they turned to face him. Greg's smirk reappeared, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Well, look at this," Greg said, his tone dripping with mock amusement. "The cavalry's here." James stopped a few feet away from them, his posture calm yet imposing. "Give back what you took," he said evenly. Greg raised an eyebrow, glancing at his friends before replying with feigned innocence. "Took? We didn't take anything, old man." "Don't lie to me," James said, his voice steel-edged. "My daughter told me everything. Hand it over." Ryan snickered, nudging Paul. "Looks like Daddy's here to save the day." Paul crossed his arms, his grin smug. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Call the cops?" James's expression remained unwavering. "You've got one chance to do the right thing. Give it back and walk away." Greg stepped forward, his smirk widening as he looked James up and down. "Or what?" James didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You don't want to find out." The air grew thick with tension, the surrounding murmurs of bystanders adding to the charged atmosphere. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But see, we don't take orders from anyone, especially not some washed-up old man." He gestured to his friends, signaling them to leave. As they turned to walk away, James took a single step forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Cowards!" The word froze the men in their tracks. Greg slowly turned back, his smirk replaced with a sharp glare. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," James said, his tone calm yet razor-sharp. "Picking on a woman sitting alone, stealing from her. That's not tough. It's pathetic." Ryan faltered, his confidence visibly shaken, but Greg stepped closer, his fists clenching. "You've got a big mouth for someone who's outnumbered." James's eyes remained locked on Greg. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched." Greg laughed, though it sounded hollow. "Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero?" "I'm a father," James replied firmly, "and I don't let men like you hurt my family." Paul lunged next, his fists flailing wildly. James moved with practiced ease, catching Paul's arm mid-swing and twisting it sharply. A yelp of pain escaped Paul's lips as James used the momentum to shove him into a pile of crates. The wooden planks clattered to the ground as Paul crumpled, groaning. Greg stood frozen for a moment, his bravado slipping away as he realized he was alone. He reached for another weapon, his eyes darting around the alley. His hand found a rusted metal pipe leaning against the wall. He gripped it tightly and stepped forward, his knuckles white. "You're not walking out of here in one piece," Greg snarled, his voice shaking despite the threat. James sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Put it down," he said firmly. "You've already lost." Greg screamed in frustration, charging at James with the pipe raised high. James sidestepped at the last second, grabbing Greg's wrist and forcing it down. With a swift, calculated motion, James wrenched the pipe from Greg's grip and tossed it aside. Before Greg could react, James delivered a powerful strike to his chest, knocking the wind out of him. Greg stumbled back, clutching his ribs and collapsing against the alley wall. Ryan and Paul were still groaning on the ground, too battered and disoriented to help. Greg, wheezing and defeated, glared up at James with tear-filled eyes. "This isn't over," he croaked. "You'll regret this." James stepped closer, his imposing figure towering over Greg. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and commanding. "It is over. If I ever see you near my daughter, or anyone else, pulling a stunt like this again, you won't get off this easy. Do you understand me?" Greg swallowed hard, his bravado completely shattered. He nodded reluctantly, his lips trembling. The sound of sirens grew louder, their wailing now accompanied by flashing lights reflecting off the brick walls of the alley. Greg's eyes darted toward the approaching police cars, panic setting in. Ryan and Paul attempted to scramble to their feet, but their injuries made it nearly impossible. James stepped back, his gaze never leaving Greg. "The cops will handle the rest," he said coldly. Moments later, officers flooded the alley, their weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked. James raised his hands slowly, nodding toward the gang on the ground. "They're the ones you're looking for." The officers quickly moved in, handcuffing Greg, Ryan, and Paul while reading them their rights. Greg shot James a final venomous glare as he was dragged away. James remained composed, his eyes following them until they were out of sight. An officer approached James. "You okay, sir?" he asked, his tone respectful. James nodded. "I'm fine. Just make sure they don't get another chance to hurt anyone." As the scene calmed, James turned and walked back toward the cafe where Angela stood waiting, her face pale and her arms wrapped tightly around herself. When he reached her, she threw her arms around him, her body trembling. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." James hugged her back, his voice soft but steady. "It's what fathers do." "They gave us a lead," James said, his tone calm but laced with determination. "Greg has a hideout, an old warehouse on the east side of town. They also mentioned a bar by the docks, a place he's used before. It's not much, but it's enough to start with." Angela let out a shaky breath, her worry giving way to a flicker of hope. "Do you think he's still there?" James's jaw tightened. "If he's smart, he's already moving. But Greg's desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. We'll catch him." The detective entered the observation room, a curious expression on his face. "Nice work in there," he said. "We've got officers en route to both locations. If Greg's at either spot, we'll find him." James nodded but remained restless. "I'm going too." The detective raised an eyebrow. "James, we've got this. You're not a cop." "I'm not waiting," James interrupted, his voice firm. "Greg's not just another criminal. He hurt people I care about. I won't let him slip away." The detective sighed, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he relented. "Fine. But stay out of the way and let us handle the arrest. The last thing we need is you complicating things." James didn't respond, his focus already on the next move. Angela stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Are you sure about this? What if it's a trap?" James looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "If it is, that's all the more reason I need to be there. I can't risk anyone else getting hurt." Angela hesitated but nodded. "Just be careful, okay?" "I will," he promised. "Stay here. I'll call as soon as I know something." Without another word, James turned and left, his steps purposeful and his mind sharp. The weight of unfinished business pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed it aside, channeling his focus into the task ahead. The hunt was on. But tonight, it was anything but forgotten. James stood with the tactical team, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. His Navy SEAL instincts kicked in, analyzing every possible angle of attack and escape. He tightened his grip on the handle of the flashlight clipped to his belt, though he doubted he'd need it. His focus was unwavering. The lead officer motioned to the group, whispering directions. "We go in quiet. Greg's got muscle, and we don't want this to turn into a shootout unless we have to." James nodded in agreement but stepped closer. "Remember, Greg is desperate. That makes him dangerous. Stay sharp." The officer gave him a curt nod, recognizing the authority in James's tone despite his civilian status. They moved as one, the crunch of gravel under their boots muffled by deliberate steps. The closer they got, the more the adrenaline pumped through James's veins, sharpening his senses. A low hum of voices carried from inside the warehouse. The group paused, taking cover behind rusted metal containers as the team leader signaled for a tactical formation. James's heart thumped, steady but hard, as he prepared to breach the building. The door creaked as the first officer pushed it open slightly, and the voices grew clearer. Greg's gruff tone cut through the muffled murmurs. "We lay low, let the heat die down. Cops won't find us, not here." James's jaw tightened. He gestured to the officer to let him take point. The officer hesitated but relented, stepping aside. James slipped into the shadows, his movements silent as he edged closer to the sound of Greg's voice. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb. Greg sat at a table, flanked by two burly men who looked more like brawlers than strategists. The space was cluttered with old crates and debris, providing ample cover but also countless hiding spots. James took a breath, then stepped into the light, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "It's over, Greg." Greg froze mid-sentence, his head snapping up. His expression morphed from shock to fury in an instant. "You," he spat, standing so abruptly his chair clattered to the ground. "I should have finished you off earlier." The two men beside Greg sprang to their feet, their hands moving toward weapons holstered at their sides. Before they could act, the tactical team swarmed in, weapons drawn and commands shouted. "Drop your weapons! Hands in the air! Now!" The brawlers hesitated, their gazes darting between Greg and the officers. Greg snarled, pulling a gun from his waistband and pointing it at James. But James was faster. With a swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing Greg's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the ground, and Greg let out a yell of pain. James didn't stop. He shoved Greg back against the table, pinning him there as the tactical team secured the other two men. Greg struggled, his eyes wild with hatred. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won?" James leaned in, his voice low and deadly. "It's over, Greg. You've lost. You don't get to hurt anyone else." Greg's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. He looked past James, his gaze falling on the team swarming the warehouse, cataloguing evidence and securing his men. For the first time, he realized the weight of his defeat. The officers hauled Greg to his feet and slapped cuffs on his wrists. He glared at James, but the bravado was gone. "This isn't over," he hissed. James straightened, his expression cold. "Yes, it is." As Greg was led away, Angela appeared at the edge of the scene, her face pale but determined. She rushed to her father, throwing her arms around him. "Dad, you're okay." James held her close, his steely demeanor softening. "It's done, Angela. He's not going to hurt anyone else." The detective approached, nodding at James. "Good work. We've got enough evidence here to put him away for a long time." James nodded, his gaze lingering on the now empty warehouse. The fight was over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. Still, as he held Angela close, he felt a deep sense of relief. He had done what he set out to do, protect his family and ensure that justice was served. But he quickly masked it with a bitter laugh. "You think you're so righteous," he spat. "This isn't the end. You'll see." James leaned closer to the window, his voice steady and cold. "You're right about one thing, Greg. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of every secret, every deal, and every crime you thought you'd buried coming to light. Enjoy the ride." Greg's glare burned into James, but there was no longer the same fire. It was replaced by a glimmer of doubt, maybe even fear, as the squad car pulled away into the night, leaving the warehouse behind. The detective approached James, his hands resting on his hips. "He's bluffing, right? About having more people." James glanced at him, his face grim. "He's always bluffing. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. We need to follow up on those ledgers and every name in them." His network didn't build itself, and taking him down might just be the start. The detective nodded, gesturing toward the officers still searching the warehouse. "We'll leave no stone unturned. With what we've already found, Greg won't see daylight for a long time." James exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping over the building. The tension of the night was ebbing, but the weight of his daughter's ordeal still lingered. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see Angela's name on the screen. "Dad." Her voice was soft but steady. "It's done," James said, his voice tired but resolute. "Greg's in custody." There was a pause, then a shaky breath of relief on the other end. "Thank you," Angela whispered. James leaned against the car, his grip tightening on the phone. "It's not just for you, Angela. It's for everyone he hurt, and everyone he could have hurt if we didn't stop him." "I know," she replied, her voice stronger now. "But it means the world to me." James smiled faintly, his eyes lifting to the dark sky. "Get some rest, sweetheart. I'll see you soon." As he ended the call, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The night had been long, the road ahead even longer, but for now, the first step had been taken. Greg Parker's reign was over, and James was ready for whatever came next. To him, but Greg didn't respond. His eyes betrayed the simmering fury beneath his rigid exterior. The jury filed into the courtroom, their expressions somber. The foreman stood as the judge addressed them. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, holding a folded piece of paper. As the verdict was read, the tension in the room was palpable. Greg Daniels was found guilty on all charges: robbery, human trafficking, illegal arms dealings, and conspiracy. Each word struck the courtroom like a hammer, the weight of justice finally bearing down on the man who had built his empire on pain and fear. Angela exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "It's done," she whispered. James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Greg. The man who had once seemed untouchable now sat powerless, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his downfall. But James felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. This was justice, not victory. There was still work to be done. The judge began the sentencing, her voice firm and unyielding. "Gregory Daniels, the crimes you have committed have caused immeasurable harm. You preyed on the vulnerable, manipulated those around you, and sought to instill fear for your own gain. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the sentence was announced. Greg didn't react, his expression eerily blank. But James caught the slight twitch in his jaw, the only sign of the storm brewing within. As the officers moved to escort Greg out of the courtroom, he turned his head, his eyes locking onto James. For a brief moment, the mask slipped, and James saw the raw hatred in Greg's gaze. "This isn't over," Greg hissed under his breath. "You'll regret this." James's expression didn't waver. He stepped forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "No, Greg. You're the one who'll regret it." Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and invigorating, the city alive with the promise of a new day. Angela stood beside her father, her arms crossed as they watched reporters swarm toward the courthouse steps. "It feels like we should be celebrating," she said softly. James glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't the kind of thing you celebrate. It's just the first step. There are still victims who need help, lives that need rebuilding. That's where the real work begins." Angela nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "What happens next?" James took a deep breath, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "We make sure no one else picks up where Greg left off, and we give people a reason to believe in justice again." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, James felt a quiet determination settle over him. Greg's reign of terror was over, but the fight for justice was far from finished. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, knowing that today, at least, they had made a difference. But understood. The battle was over, but the emotional toll it had taken on them both was evident. The silence between them was heavy, filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. Angela finally broke the quiet, her voice soft but steady. "You're right. It's never really over, is it?" James turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers. He nodded slowly, his voice low and thoughtful. "No. There will always be more work to do. People like Greg don't just disappear, and the world doesn't magically become perfect when one man is taken down. But for now, we've made a difference." Angela looked down at her tea, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup. "Do you think he ever thought it would end like this? That he'd lose everything?" James sighed, stepping away from the window and leaning against the wall, his expression distant. "No. He thought he could control it all. People like him never think they'll get caught. They just keep going, hurting anyone who gets in their way." "I know," she said, her voice quiet. "But it still feels like it happened so fast. One moment he was this untouchable force, and now he's nothing." James took a slow breath. Sometimes it takes a long time for things to crumble, and sometimes, when it happens all at once. They sat in silence again, each reflecting on the journey they'd been through. The weight of the past few weeks, the lives affected by Greg's crimes, and the long road ahead in helping those victims weighed heavily on both of them. Angela glanced up at her father. "What do we do now?" James paused, thinking about the future. "We keep moving forward. We help who we can, and we stay vigilant. Greg's network may be fractured, but there will always be others like him." Angela nodded, her fingers nervously tapping on the mug. "And you'll keep going, right? With all of it?" James looked at her, his expression softer than usual. "As long as there's work to do, I'll keep going. But I'm not alone anymore." He smiled faintly, a quiet reassurance in his words. "I've got you." Angela smiled back, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. It wasn't just about the cases, the work, or the justice. It was about the people they had around them and the way they faced everything together. The night stretched on, the silence between them now a comfortable one, as the weight of the world, for a brief moment, seemed a little lighter. The evening stretched on, the weight of the world outside fading into a quiet, shared understanding between father and daughter. Despite the silence, there was comfort in the space they occupied, a space that had grown familiar through the struggles they'd faced together. Angela sat back in the couch, feeling the exhaustion begin to creep into her bones. She wanted to ask more questions, to probe deeper into her father's thoughts, but for once, the need for answers seemed less urgent. Instead, she let herself rest in the moment. James, too, sat back in his chair, his eyes on the dim light filtering through the window. His mind was heavy with the case, the names in the ledger, the people who had been hurt. But there was peace in knowing that, for now, they had done what they could. There were still shadows, still work to be done, but the darkness had been pushed back. He glanced at Angela, her face softened in thought. He could see the uncertainty still lingering in her eyes, but he knew she had the strength to carry on. They both did. "You know," he said quietly, his voice low but steady, "it's funny. You get used to the weight of it all. The pressure, the stakes. You think you can't bear it, but then you do. And you move forward." Angela met his gaze, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of her lips. "Is that what you've been doing all these years? Moving forward?" James chuckled softly. "That, and a little bit of running away." She raised an eyebrow. "Running away? From what?" "From the things I couldn't fix. The lives I couldn't save. The times I failed." His smile faded, his voice turning a touch more serious. "But I've learned something, Angela. It's not about erasing the mistakes or fixing every wrong. It's about doing what you can, when you can. And sometimes, that's enough." Angela nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. She thought back to everything they'd been through, to the moments of doubt, fear, and loss. But in the end, they had made a difference. The stolen goods, the dismantling of Greg's operation, the lives they had helped, those were victories. They wouldn't solve every problem, but they mattered. "Yeah," she said softly, "it's enough." For a while, they sat there in the soft light, the world outside quiet and still, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges. But for tonight, they could rest. Together.